What's up, guys? So, today I'm going to be talking about Cat Marnell's memoir, How to Murder Your Life, which talks about her addiction. If you don't know who Cat Marnell is, she worked for print beauty publications, particularly Lucky, which went under, but it's one of the Condé Nast publications in the beauty and fashion family. So, if you're not a millennial or older, you won't know how culturally prestigious those publications in, again, the fashion and makeup and beauty industry really were, but they were followed by like any American in any sort of social circle who had an interest in fashion, beauty, makeup, that kind of thing, before the internet really took over those industries. So if you don't know who I am, which is exponentially more likely than that you won't know who Cat Marnell is, my name is Brian. I'm a teacher. I have been on and off of benzos and opioids for 20 years. I've been off of benzos for over a year now, as well as all other substances, but I'm on methadone maintenance and tapering off of that at the moment, getting toward the final part of that process. So I'm not going to talk too much about that because I have other videos about my own stuff. But yeah, that's Kat, that's me. And I probably should have said that Kat really took off, not because of what she did as a print beauty or even an online beauty writer and editor, but she took off because her life was a mess and she became like the it girl mascot of messy white girls in particular. So she really like owned it. She had a video when she started writing for XO Jane. She had a video where she like pretended to snort bath salts. She had like, I would say, a good sense of humor and irony about it. She would write like tips for showering, like while you're sitting or something like that. Like she really just didn't even try to hide how her life was at that point. After she could no longer work for XO Jane because of an email she wrote about being dope sick, she went over to Vice, wrote a column there that I think was called Amphetamine Logic. So yeah, she really became famous not for what she was doing in the print beauty industry. She became more mainstream because of her addiction and a very sort of publicized fireworks and fallout due to that in her life. So before I get into the substance of the book, if you are thinking about reading it and you want to know sort of what it feels like to read it, I would say her strong point as a writer is absolutely. I watched one interview with her where they asked her what her tips are for other writers. And she said, for me, the most important one was write the way you talk. And I was 100% expecting that from her because this book sounds, in probably the best possible sense, like you took a freshman creative writing major, sat them down, and told them in your own voice, tell us a story about your life. Tell us about something important or funny or sad that you went through and use your own voice. So, the saving grace of the lack of literary technique is that her voice has a lot of value in it. Okay, so people have said that she's basically like a Nepo baby, that she's a hack who only got where she did in the print beauty industry because her parents were able to pay her rent in New York City for years while she did unpaid internships to rise up through the ranks. And while there is truth in that she admits to, I don't think she's talentless. I think she has a really strong and distinctive voice, and that, as I'll talk about in my review, as a confessional writer, that can save you. However, there are huge limits to that. And in particular, her book comes across as, at points, really blithe, especially when it comes to the effect of her addiction on other people who are being hurt by it. Again, I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But, and I think if I'm being charitable toward her, that might be partially because when all you have is sort of straightforward storytelling, it's hard to express sincere regret and sincere sort of apology without it sounding insincere, again, even when you really mean it. So that's where literary technique really comes in. That's where you want to have some like figment from a recurring dream appear during the day. That's when you want to use really poetic language because you can drive home the sincerity of it without beating someone over the head with straightforward language that, again, often does the opposite of what it's supposed to do. So I think she might partially come across the way that she does because of that. And again, when I am writing this, I'm not making judgments about Cat Marnell, the person, because I don't know Cat Marnell, the person. I know her as she reveals herself in this memoir, and as she's revealed herself in the interviews and podcasts that I'm going to talk about to sort of add context to what I say about her book. Okay, so if you love Cat Marnell and you think I'm being overly harsh, keep that in mind. And also, please wait till the very end because I'm going to talk about her very public fallout with her older sister, Emily Marnell, and what I think that tells us about what was going on with her life in the time after this book was published. And I'm going to talk about how she's doing today and how there's a lot of cause for optimism compared to what most of my review makes it sound like. Okay, so especially if you support Cat, please wait all the way until the end because there is balance to what I'm saying. The bottom line is that she wrote this book and did all the publicity stuff and the interviews for it during a time when she was incontrovertibly in active addiction. And judging someone for their actions while they're in active addiction is a lot like judging someone for their actions while they're in like a psychotic episode. Like they might be a wonderful person underneath, they might be a horrible person underneath. Like you're just not going to know. You can't tell until they're stable enough to get out of that survival mode and just that frankly insane mode where their brain is so influenced by the substances that they're taking in that there is, there's no insight into the underlying character that emerges when people are stable. So without further ado, this is my review of Cat Marnell's 2016 memoir, How to Murder Your Life. If you're wondering what the Cat Marnell who emerges in her 2016 memoir, How to Murder Your Life is like, picture Cher Horowitz from Clueless if she had been on Rewire Your Fake Christmas Tree amounts of Addie. Okay, Cher probably was. Imagine if she had gotten pregnant before graduating from prep school, then ignored the problem for so long that her parents had to pick her up and transport her to a different state to get an abortion, then lost her Barnard acceptance due to message board shenanigans and decided to move to New York City instead, where she began interning for beauty magazines and K-holing with minor celebrities, in between wielding stilettos during Benadryl and amphetamine psychosis-induced battles with imaginary rodents. That's Kat as she writes about herself during peak active addiction, and in presenting those messy moments, she is at her finest. Cat Marnell began her writing career at Lucky and other print publications in the beauty industry, and her addiction memoir stays true to her dirty blonde roots. It's very what I wore to my first abortion and how to conceal track marks with 3 products you already have in your purse. At times, there is a dark humor to Kat's brand of addictive maelstrom that I can't help but appreciate. If nothing else, it can be said that Kat is unapologetically herself. For a confessional writer, this can mean everything. Kat's portrayal of her white, upper-middle-class family's dysfunction paints a picture that many millennials will identify with. Kat's psychiatrist father and licensed clinical social worker mother were all too ready to believe that prescription amphetamines would be the solution to the troublesome teenage Kat's issues. They also authorized the kidnapping of Kat's older sister, Emily, so that she could be hauled out of state to a school where she was physically and psychologically abused, a la Paris Hilton. Kat's parents might seem effortlessly put together in their own professional and social lives, but they are utterly inept as parents. Her grandmother, who Kat calls Mimi, is Kat's shelter from this storm. Mimi gives Kat insight into her mother's college-era anorexia, as well as practical support in pursuing her career aspirations after Kat has taken a flamethrower to her life. Kat is a self-proclaimed weird girl, and her social isolation fuels friendships and romantic relationships that tend toward the intense and codependent. Sometimes, as is the case with her friend Marco, who she later suggests is a malignant narcissist, they even become violent. I wrote a piece on why I detest the current trend of throwing around cluster B terminology, which says as much about the person using it as it does about who they're talking about, but for now, I will leave that alone. Kat's tendency to end up in twisted relationships is something that I can deeply relate to, being so desperate for human connection that I ignored the red flags, all too glad to pretend that someone else's issues didn't exist if they simply did the same for me, that we were in our own little world where societal norms simply didn't apply. Don't even get me started on my proclivity to meet someone and then become intimate with them on every level far too quickly, justifying this based on my quote-unquote instant connection with them, not realizing that I had painted a neon target on my back for anyone who wanted to manipulate me. Kat also does a bang-up job of describing the battle between her addiction and her ambition to become a beauty editor, which leads to her walking away from a key opportunity at Lucky. While reading this scene, I was reminded of the day when pursuing my calling to become a doctor while wrestling with the demons of my opioid and benzo addictions became too much. Apropos of nothing, I took a leave of absence from medical school and never went back. Anyone who has sacrificed a lifelong dream on the altar of their addiction will find resonance with this aspect of Kat's story. Kat doesn't have all the answers. This is okay. In the conclusion to her book, Cat admits that she still uses Adderall, her drug of choice, though she insists that she has curtailed her habit and is attending to her physical and mental health in a more responsible way. In a certain sense, I admire Cat's honesty. For most people, addiction is a cyclic, lifelong struggle, and it is regrettable that we hear almost exclusively from the small proportion of addicts who believe that they have found the long term solution. I almost said final solution when I first wrote this. In complete abstinence through 12-step meetings, DBT, Sufi chanting, or whatever. My own struggle with addiction has led me to pursue recovery in different forms at different times, so I found Kat's representation of what recovery can look like in the absence of complete abstinence to be a refreshing departure from the usual fare. On the other hand, lacking answers and lacking insight are not the same thing, and there are moments in the book, reinforced by Kat's comments elsewhere, that lead me to question whether Kat is in a place from which she can write about her life in a rigorously honest way. Kat seems to believe that the combination of a dysfunctional childhood plus an early medically instigated Adderall addiction led to the downward spiral that began during her adolescence and lasted through her mid-30s. I was disappointed that Kat's commentary on her own character defects is mostly confined to a couple of sections in which she perfunctorily notes that she has inconvenienced her roommate, Neve Catfish Shulman, by subjecting him to the violent fallout of her relationship with Marco. Ditto for a coworker from a beauty magazine who Kat stressed out on this coworker's wedding day. I don't expect performative self-flagellation, of course, but Kat's attention to her own intrinsic flaws is as superficial as a lipstick review. She has a tendency to paint herself as a victim, placing the blame for much of the mayhem in her life on ADHD or on other people without ever acknowledging or examining the part of herself that clearly gravitates toward chaos, drama, and self-destruction, the part of her that forms unhealthy relationships with people and then lets them back into her life again and again. I would be more inclined to believe that this failure of self-reflection is just an artifact of the writing and editing process if it weren't for Kat's conduct before and after publishing her book. In a YouTube video from May 2023 that features Kat talking about with British acquaintances, Kat blithely responds to one question with, quote unquote, "I know that I'm a good person," which she goes on to qualify by saying that this means that she never sets out to harm others. In my younger days, I too put great emphasis on my good intentions, failing to recognize that perhaps being a quote-unquote good person is as much about the objective results of our actions as it is about nebulous intentions. What's that saying about the road to hell, Kat? Kat's treatment of her older sister, Emily, reinforces my suspicions that she has a long way to go in terms of character examination and amends making. In the book, Kat portrays Emily as a devoted sister who is also the victim of their parents' dysfunctional decision-making. She mentions that Emily lets her stay on her couch when Kat needs a place to crash, and that Emily rushes to Kat's apartment when Kat is locked inside, overdosing. Imagine my surprise then when I learned about Kat's massive public falling out with Emily in the years after the book was published. Apparently, this was absolutely smeared all over Reddit, mostly by Emily Marnell herself. So apparently this involved Kat staying with Emily and Emily's now ex-husband for a time, during which she allegedly got Emily introduced to and addicted to Adderall, and then Emily alleges ditched her as soon as the money ran out due to Emily's divorce. Kat now presents an entirely different version of the family dynamics in which Emily is a money-hungry, manipulative bully, whereas her father is a healed man. In fact, Kat and her father sued Emily for her comments and actions during a time when Emily was recently divorced, unable to see her children, dealing with severe mental health challenges, and purportedly penniless. I actually came across on Reddit a screenshot of some of the documents from that lawsuit, and it was like the ultimate in white girl telling her lawyer, like, put this in there, this is important too, because like the first couple paragraphs of the part of the brief or whatever it is for a civil suit that I saw was just like all talking about how anxious it made Kat to know that her sister could maybe show up to a public appearance and heckle her or something like that, which I guess maybe she had threatened to do, and it took a few paragraphs to get into like, okay, loss of income from canceling gigs because of that. It reminded me of Caroline Calloway's eviction proceedings, where the whole beginning of it is just like, this was her first ever home. You know, it's like that is the legal documents are probably never the place to do that. But yeah, if you had I should have said this in the beginning, but if you had to choose sort of comparables for this book, it would probably be say Cat Marnell, How to Murder Your Life, Caroline Calloway's memoir, which I can't remember the title of at the moment, and then Julia Fox's Down the Drain are probably in the same general it girl addiction memoir cluster. So anyway, I can't imagine how it feels for Emily, who rushed all over New York City catering to Kat's crises during the events written about in How to Murder Your Life, to be not just abandoned but also excoriated by her high profile little sister during her time of need. Again, it leads me to question the depth and authenticity of Kat's self examination. This isn't the kind of behavior that we would expect from someone who is truly in recovery. Now, there are also some limitations to the book in terms of Kat's addictive experiences not really being that relatable, in my opinion. Perhaps Kat's self insight would be greater if her privilege hadn't protected her from some of the wretched lows that most addicts experience. For years after graduating from high school, Kat lived in Manhattan on her parents' dime, which allowed her to spend her days at coveted unpaid internships and her nights at exclusive clubs frequented by New York City's who's who. Kat was never homeless, and at the lowest points in her active addiction, she always had the option to return to her grandmother's place down south and work in exchange for 20 or 30 grand to catch up on rent and to fund her next bender. She was never arrested, partly because her addiction was primarily to prescription drugs obtained from doctors. It is so thoroughly, boringly predictable that the rich, beautiful, blonde girl beauty blogger got the six-figure book deal, likely using contacts built up during her years of partying with similarly privileged people. By the way, if you think about the alliteration in that sentence I just said, I didn't even need 60 milligrams of dexedrine to get me there. Whatever happened to the Basketball Diaries? One of my favorite things about addiction memoirs has been that, like queer art, they traditionally take us to the fringes of society. This is sort of like the opposite of that. On this point, in one Vice column, Kat wrote that quote unquote girl drug addicts sleep alone. I recall reading that line and having a visceral negative reaction. Almost all of the female drug addicts that I knew exchanged sex for money at some point. Those who didn't were nearly all stuck in awful relationships with dealers or other manipulators, forced to rely on men to fund and quote unquote protect them in a dangerous, exploitative subculture. I'm not suggesting that Kat's story isn't worth telling because she's from a privileged background, because stories about addiction from every level of society are important and need to be heard. But to the extent that this privileged background has limited Kat's insight into herself and her disease, it does take away from the power, reach, and authenticity of her story. Final thing I want to talk about is Cat Marnell and the 12 steps. There's a final point that I'd like to touch on again, and to me it is the most egregious. It's also not directly related to the book. In the years since she published How to Murder Your Life, Kat has been honest about her struggle with maintaining sobriety. She admits to overdosing on fentanyl and has expressed wanting to give up Adderall but not being able to because she needs it to be quote unquote functional. In a podcast with Leah McSweeney from The Real Housewives of New York City from March 2023, Kat indicated that she now had 72 days of real deal complete sobriety, which she said she had achieved through 12-step program participation. Now, Kat was acting a little strange in that interview, but I'm going to leave that alone. For those of you who are familiar with the program, you will immediately recognize the problem with this statement. Anonymity is one of the 12 pillars of the AA/NA programs, a revered tradition that prevents the conflation of programs with personalities. This would be especially dangerous for a disease like addiction, for which lifetime relapse rates are so high and struggles with sobriety tend to be so messy. A high-profile relapse on the part of someone perceived to be a leader of a 12-step program could seriously damage its public image. Kat herself acknowledges the tradition of anonymity, but she chooses to discuss her participation in 12-step fellowships nevertheless because it's known that all the best people are in the program. I'm paraphrasing there. I think what she actually said sounds even more vapid. Coming from someone with only 72 days of sobriety under her belt, this is a shockingly blithe, asinine statement. Kat's life is precisely the type of public mess that the tradition of anonymity is designed to prevent the program from being associated with. Like me, she's a chronic relapser, and if or when she has another relapse, she risks giving people who have little experience with the program the impression that it's ineffective. Now, I have another video on my problems with the 12-step program if you want to watch that. It is ineffective. By the best possible data, it is no more effective than just sort of the spontaneous recovery rate for addiction. What would happen if you just suddenly decided you want to get clean and sober and tried to do that on your own? Having said that, and acknowledging that I don't any longer recommend 12-step participation as a primary recovery modality, although I still occasionally attend meetings myself. What I'm saying in this review is still valid in my opinion because the 12-step programs are the only game in town in most of the United States and indeed most of the world right now in terms of peer support that doesn't cost any money. And so because of that, I still think it's lousy what she did to possibly damage the credibility of the program. So on that point, speaking frankly, Kat's discussion of her participation in the program just pisses me off. For decades, involvement in AA and NA programs has allowed people whose lives are in ruins to climb a ladder back to functionality and stability. Oftentimes, key housing and job opportunities for recovering addicts have hinged on the endorsement of a longtime member of AA or NA who sticks his or her neck out on behalf of someone who is newer in recovery and needs that chance. With her reckless comments, Kat is devaluing the social capital of the AA and NA programs, and out of all of the above, this is perhaps what bothers me most about her. That she does this rather so cluelessly is unfortunately on brand for the type of heedless person that her memoir reveals her to be. I'm reminded of the quote unquote careless Daisy Buchanan from The Great Gatsby when I think of Kat. So right to the point, summary of all of the above, How to Murder Your Life is worth reading from a pop culture standpoint if you're into the millennial New York City scene and or the beauty industry. Millennial addicts will likely find points of relatability in Cat Marnell's description of her family dynamics, high school experience, and active addiction escapades. Beyond that, Cat Marnell shows an unbecoming lack of self-insight in her memoir that is reinforced by her public actions and comments. It's unfortunate that she has been rewarded with a six-figure book deal when so many people with more interesting stories and better language to tell them in have not. Where's my book deal? So I wanted to add at the end, like I said, a little update on how Kat is doing today. And I think the most promising aspect or the most telling fact about how she's doing today is how quiet she is on social media and how there isn't any publicity around some sort of like impulsive actions or fights with family or anything like that. Now, in a 2024 interview, Kat said that she has been clean and sober for 2 years. And again, based on the limited evidence available to us, I have every reason to suspect that that is the case. And I love that for her. I think it's awesome, however, she achieved it. And she said that in that same interview that she is now writing an autobiographical novel about her messy and sexy 30s. So if that comes out, I might check it out. I think if she continues to write mainly based on her own life experience, she will end up in the sort of Elizabeth Wurtzel pigeonhole, which I think is something that can happen to you as a writer if you rely only on your voice and only on talking about things that happen to you individually. It really limits you in the long run. And again, it puts you in that confessional author pigeonhole that I think is often not good for someone in terms of developing their range and versatility. But I liked her first book. I enjoyed it enough that I will check out this autobiographical novel if it comes out. And I'm so happy for Kat. I hope that the family dynamics are improved and that everything is mended between Kat and Emily, and it is their right to handle that out of the public eye. And I really hope that that's the way that they are handling it, because it's almost always worse to try to do this stuff in public lawsuits and in newspapers and that kind of thing. So please, if you have any experience with Kat or anything else that I talked about in this video, leave a comment. Give it a like if you enjoyed it. And yeah, I will catch you guys next time. Thank you so much for listening.